the Republican vote thieves strike again. I mean, this is, you know, I keep saying Republicans can't win elections by campaigning on the actual positions that they hold, because the positions that Republicans hold benefit the fossil fuel industry, billionaires in America, multi-millionaires in America, and racist bigots. That's it. And there's not enough millionaires, billionaires, fossil fuel executives, and bigots to win an election. So what do? Well, they rig the rules of the game. For example, in 2020, there were a number of polls done down in Texas. And what they found was that Joe Biden had a good chance of beating Donald Trump. In fact, Biden was ahead of Trump in the polls. Now, the polls, keep in mind, 2020 was the pandemic year. So the polls are asking people who, are registered voters and have voted in the past, asking them who would you vote for in a hypothetical matchup between Trump and Biden. And they were saying Biden. But the problem was they weren't able to ask them, honestly speaking, are you willing to take your life in your hands to go vote? Because COVID was running around. And in November of 2020, there was no vaccine. You literally took your life in your hands to vote. Now, if you lived in rural Texas, in Red County, Texas, it wasn't anywhere near the risk because the low population towns and rural areas, the line to vote was typically 2-3 people long. You didn't expose yourself to very many people in order to vote. So the risk was quite small. In Houston, though, which is Harris County has 4.7 million people, 2.5 million registered voters. In Harris County, where Republicans, over the years, all across the state, of course, had been trying to make it harder to vote. In Harris County, it's a whole different thing. There, when you go to vote, there's probably going to be, 100, 200 people in line. Do you really want to get COVID? 1 million Americans died of it. Probably at that point in time, it was around 800,000 dead Americans in November of 2020. So Harris County came up with a solution. Harris County is Houston. It's the largest blue county. It's the largest county in Texas, first off. As I said, 4.7 million people. It's also the largest blue county in Texas, and it's solidly blue, Harris County. And so the Democrats who run Harris County came up with an idea to deal with the pandemic. Why don't we mail out an application for a mail-in ballot to all of the registered voters in the county? All 2.5 million of them. Now, they weren't mailing ballots. They were only mailing the application for a mail-in ballot. But still, that was enough to make Ken Paxton, the guy who just got impeached last week, the Attorney General of Texas, totally freak out. Oh, my God, we're going to see a Biden presidency. We can't have that. And he filed a lawsuit. Said, you got to stop this. You guys cannot mail out those mail-in ballot applications. And his lawsuit went before the Texas Supreme Court. The Texas Supreme Court is filled with Republicans. Surprise, surprise. And they said, yeah, Harris County, you can't mail those things out. Pandemic or no pandemic, you can't do it. And this is what Attorney General Paxton told Steve Bannon on his radio show, or on his podcast. I guess it's both. It's his podcast radio show. He said, and I quote, if we lost Harris County, keep in mind, Trump won by 620,000 votes in Texas. Harris County mail-in ballots that they wanted to send out were 2.5 million. And we were able to stop every one of them. He goes on to say, and again, this is, he's bragging. He's talking to Steve Bannon. He said, had we not done that, we would have been in the very same situation. We would have been on Election Day. I was watching on Election night, and I knew when I saw what was happening in those other states that did expand mail-in voting for the pandemic, that would have been Texas. We would have been in the same boat. We would have been one of those battleground states that they were counting votes in Harris County for 3 days, and Donald Trump would have lost the election. Right. In Texas, voter turnout is 60.4%. Here in Oregon, where I live, it's 75.5%. What makes the difference? Well, in Texas, it's really hard to vote. It's hard to even register to vote. You've got to do it 30 days before the election. And very often, they don't process your voter registration within those 30 days. So, it can take months for your voter registration to get processed in Texas. Here in Oregon, you know, it's pretty much instant. You get a driver's license, you're registered to vote. It's pretty automatic. In most democratically controlled states, it is easy to register, it is easy to vote, and there's really no concern about voter fraud. We have been voting by mail exclusively here in Oregon for over 25 years, over a quarter century. And there has never been any allegation of consequential voter fraud, of any kind of voter fraud that might have changed an election outcome. Never. We're not the only state that does this, by the way. The Washington State, Colorado, Hawaii, and Utah all conduct their elections entirely by mail. Now, interestingly, Utah and Hawaii don't have the real high voter turnout that Colorado, Oregon, and Washington State have. I think that's probably because Hawaii is so blue that people just don't, you know, they know what the outcome of the election is going to be. Same thing in Utah. Utah is so red, they know the outcome of the election. It's whatever the Mormon church dictates, basically. So, you know, it just goes the way it goes. But if you look at the states that are the easiest, that are the best states for voting, the top 10 voter turnout states that have the highest voter turnout, and that goes from Minnesota at the very top with 79.9% voter turnout, all the way down to Maryland with 71% voter turnout. That's the top 10. Out of that top 10, 9 out of those top 10 states are democratically controlled. I mean, this kind of tells you everything. Democrats believe in democracy, Republicans don't. If you look at the bottom 10 states, the worst states for voter turnout, like, you know, Oklahoma with 54%, Arkansas 56%, Virginia 57%. Keep in mind, we're 75% here in Oregon, 79% Minnesota, Virginia 57%, Tennessee 59%. All but one of those states in the bottom 10 are Republican controlled. So, you know, here we are. Now, Democrats wanted to do something about this, and they actually had Lisa Murkowski in on this. And that was this bill that was dropped last year. It was called the Freedom to Vote Act. And it would have blown up 50 years of Republican voter suppression. It included, and I'm just going to go through the list real quickly here. It's a very long list. Automatic voter registration and online registration, same-day voter registration nationwide, an end to partisan gerrymandering, limiting all campaign contributions to a maximum of 10 grand, criminalizing pass-through groups to get around campaign finance laws, making all websites like Facebook with more than 50 million users create a publicly available archive of political ads, bring web-based election rules under the same disclosure requirements as television has, makes it a federal crime to prevent a qualified person from registering to vote, requires 14 consecutive days of early voting at least 10 hours a day, requires easy access to polling places for rural and college campus voters, guarantees that all voters nationwide can vote by mail with no excuses necessary, requires states to give voters the ability to track their mail-in ballots, forbids states from forcing mail-in voters to have their ballots witnessed, notarized, or jump through other onerous hoops, requires secured and clearly labeled ballot drop boxes, requires the post office to process all ballots on the day they're dropped off without postage, allows people waiting in line to receive food or water from others, gives the right of felons who have served their sentences to vote, prohibits voter caging, where failing to send a postcard back gets you purged from the list. It criminalizes intimidating, threatening, or coercing election officials, requires federal prosecution of anybody who tries to dox or harm federal election officials, makes it a federal crime to publish or distribute false information about when and where elections are being held, increases the penalties for voter intimidation, requires post-election audits. I mean, you know, this is just a great piece of legislation. It was filibustered in the Senate, and Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin would not break the filibuster. But we can bring this back, and we need to be focusing on this.